right, definers, welcome back to Sustainability Defined, where Scott and I are here defining sustainability, one topic and one bad joke at a time. This is episode 78 on invasive species. So Scott, let's get this party going. What does the outline look like today?
So we'll start, of course, with, well, what are invasive species? And then why are they a problem? How do invasive species travel? How has the issue evolved, like gotten worse, more complex over time, and is it set to get even worse? Who is leading efforts to combat invasive species? What policies are being pursued to address them? What can definers do to help address invasive species? We always like to do that, Jay, right? What can people do about all this?
Obviously.
And then our expert guest, Leigh Greenwood, Forest, Pest, and Pathogen Program Director at the Nature Conservancy. All right, Jay, as promised, what are invasive species?
The National Wildlife Federation defines an invasive species as, quote, any living organism that is not native to an ecosystem and causes harm. Plants, animals, insects, fish, fungi, bacteria, or really any living thing or its parts, like seeds or eggs, can be called an invasive if they harm the environment or even the economy or human health. These species have negative impacts on native animals and plants, which in turn affect the natural balance of the ecosystem. Contrary to popular belief, Scott, these species don't have to come from another country to be considered invasive. They just need to be from outside of their traditional habitat, which obviously opens the floodgates of how bad this could get.
Sure, and not all non-native species, though, Jay, are invasive species.
Right.
For example, food that's grown in the United States, like wheat, tomatoes, and rice, that's not native to North American habitats. But they're not considered invasive because they do not harm the native species in the area. Now, it is important to note that it is extremely difficult to predict which species will become invasive within an area and what negative effects they could have within a new geography. It could take years before a population grows large enough to be deemed invasive. But Jay, I think here the key point is to be invasive, you gotta be non-native and you gotta cause some harm.
That's right. So, Scott, let's ask then the next question. Well, what makes these invasive species such a problem? Well, invasive species can cause extinction of native plants and animals and can significantly alter local habitats by outcompeting native species for limited resources. As these new species will have no natural predators, parasites, or competitors in their new area, they can often grow in numbers rapidly. This rapid or significant population growth results in the displacement or eradication of native species by significantly reducing their natural habitats and or food sources.
All right, Jay, we've peppered these intro notes with a variety of examples. Let's do the first one here. And this is the zebra mussel. So these mussels, they attach themselves to boats, gaining a free ride to other ecosystems. Once there, they outcompete the native species for space and food, and once established, they are very hard to remove. They reproduce rapidly, and they often eat all of the microorganisms like plankton from the area, and this causes the entire ecosystem to suffer. As the zebra mussels take food and space from the other animals, those native populations shrink, and the entire ecosystem is ultimately altered. So this is the pattern that is followed by most invasive species. They outcompete, overpopulate, and overtake, and they don't pay for their boat rides.
Critical. Okay. In the process of overpopulating and overtaking a region, these species can have detrimental effects. In September of 2023, the United Nations Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, released an assessment report on invasive alien species. The main takeaway from the report was that these invasive species pose major global threats to nature, economies, food security, and human health. The report not only provides details on how invasive species have affected various regions around the globe, it also offers tools and solutions to help governments work towards mitigating these negative effects to create a path forward. Now, notably, this report mentioned that nearly 85% of the impacts these invasions have on native species are negative. So let's dive a little bit deeper into each of these threats, focusing specifically on nature, food security, economy, and human health to better understand why invasive species are such a problem.
So Jay, we will do that. But I do want to mention, do you remember when I emailed you about this September 2023 report, you and Taylor, and I was like, hey, this is interesting news. We should do an episode on this.
Yeah, totally.
And then I posted to LinkedIn about it. And then all of a sudden, I noticed the post had like a lot of impressions, like more than one of my posts would normally get. And I was like, what is going on? And then I realized that, you know how LinkedIn, they have LinkedIn News, and then they put random people's posts there? Yes. Mine was like the number one post on the invasive species news. So I had like all these random people commenting on it. So I think that's a LinkedIn pro tip, which I just learned naturally, but that if you comment on like hot news, like invasive species reports, you can get like cited as a post around that news and then get seen by random people.
Right. So Scott, naturally, when this episode drops, whoever posts about it is obviously going to get, top of the feed of LinkedIn news because this episode is such a huge deal.
Exactly. Race to the top of LinkedIn.
There we go.
All right. So, Jay, you mentioned we're going to look at 4 things. Let's do nature first. So we briefly talked about invasive species within episode 72 on biodiversity because invasive species, they're one of the top factors contributing to biodiversity loss, right along with climate change, pollution, exploitation, and changes in land and sea use. The report noted that these organisms can cause irreversible damage to our ecosystems, contributing to extinction. According to the 2023 report, invasive species have been a major factor to 60% of all recorded animal and plant extinctions. Yeesh.
Yeah, that's not even, quote, a minor factor. That's a major factor in over half.
Mm-hmm. Major.
All right, so this goes hand in hand with these invasive species affecting food security by damaging our food supplies. Invasive species affect food security in 2 main ways, according to the Pacific Invasives Initiative. First, they decrease the production within agriculture, forestry, fishing, and other sectors that are critical to food production. Second, the biodiversity loss and degradation of the native ecosystem services within an area as a result of the invasives can further directly affect production and harvests of our own foods.
So here's another example definers, the fish tilapia. It's a native species to Africa and the Middle East, but it's been introduced into many other regions of the world due to the rise of aquaculture and the demand for the fish as a food source. However, this popularity has resulted in tilapia becoming one of the world's most globalized fish, as they have found their way from aquaculture into natural habitats and even into biodiversity hotspots, posing serious threat to native species. And if I recall, Jay, tilapia are pretty good when it comes to aquaculture because I think they can eat plants and they don't have to eat other fish. So they have that going for them. But yeah, if they get out, not so great. And I guess people might have to rethink their fish tacos.
That's right. Well, and I'm just thinking, I just thought tilapia was so ubiquitous. I had actually no idea that it was native to Africa and was that the Middle East. So yeah, my goodness. Okay. All right. So that was nature and food security. Next, let's look at the economic costs of invasive species. Mm-hmm. The 2023 UN report we mentioned just a minute ago found that invasive species cost more than $423 billion per year.
That's a lot.
In fact, that's a lot of money. In fact, the costs of invasive species have quadrupled each decade since 1970. As invasive species have become more prevalent over time and continue to grow, for reasons we'll get into here in a bit, the dollar amount of impact is not shockingly set to grow as well. The majority of the economic impact of these species is due to their contribution to damaging ecosystems, people, and our quality of life.
That might be the party fact of the episode there, Jay. That amount of money and the fact that it's quadrupled each decade just tells you how big the problem is and how it's gotten so bad over time.
Uh-huh.
All right, so additional costs are associated with the control and management of invasive species, and these costs can add up quickly like we're talking about. Consider the oriental fruit fly, which has become invasive in the states of Florida, Hawaii, and many other parts of the world. It's known to attack more than 400 different fruits and vegetables, including citrus fruits, peaches, tomatoes, and apricots. Stay away from the stone fruit fly. Stone fruit is the best. God. All right, the fruit flies lay their eggs within the produce, using it as a host, and once the eggs hatch, the produce is inedible. Even though a fruit fly outbreak was spotted quickly in Florida, it was estimated that farmers lost an estimated $10 million over the time it took to remediate. In addition, the government likely spent over $3 million in remediation.
Scott, I'm embarrassed to say I don't even know what the stone fruit class is.
Well, it's like peaches and apricots, like I was saying, stuff with I think the pits in them.
Okay, like pits as big as stones, I guess. You could, skip across the water.
I guess.
Like
I
that.
guess I should be asking why are they called stone fruit? I just know they're delicious.
That's indisputable. Okay.
So Jay, I just looked this up. Stone fruits. They're called that because the flesh surrounds a large stone-like pit which contains the seed. You were right.
Bingo.
Nice
All
done.
right. Nice. Next up is what? Stone fruit pit skipping competitions on open water.
Nice.
Okay. These oriental fruit flies were actually spotted once again in Florida in 2022, which prompted a quarantine order that halted the movement of fruits and vegetables that did not have a compliance agreement from the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services.
I thought it was a quarantine order for the fruit flies there for a second.
Yeah, I guess, I guess we're not concerned about their safety, really. But this was in an effort to protect the crops in the areas from being exposed and to take the time to eradicate the existing flies using bait and insecticide. Now, back in 2015, when the oriental fruit fly was last seen prior to 2022, a quarantine of over 85 square miles of farmland in Miami-Dade was established in order to stop the spread and eradicate this invasive population.
Yeah, so Jay, we're talking about the cost to manage this stuff. And just to zoom out a bit and give a broader number. So in 2015, U.S. federal agencies invested almost $2.3 billion in the management of invasive species. That is similar to the entire budget of the U.S. National Park Service. So, these are big numbers.
Yeah, that's actually, I'm happy you said that's that helps put it in perspective for sure. All right, so in addition, like many environmental and sustainability impacts, it is often the most marginalized that bear the brunt of the impact. People with the greatest reliance on nature, like indigenous peoples and smaller communities, are at the greatest risk of feeling the effects of these impacts. The UN IPBES study reports that more than 2,300 invasive species are found on indigenous lands, which could threaten their quality of life and their cultural practices.
All right, so you talk nature, food security, economic costs, and now let's talk human health. So invasives can have a direct effect on spreading pathogens and as vectors for disease. Diseases like malaria, the Zika virus, they're actually spread by invasive mosquito species. Aren't all mosquitoes, let's just call them all invasive. I don't know where they came from, but they all suck.
Fine by me.
All right.
All right, now Scott, let's circle back to that zebra mussel, which you described earlier, which causes damage to local ecosystems by outcompeting the native animals and plants, causing an imbalance in the ecosystem that can increase the numbers of blue-green algae, which is what causes toxic algal blooms that can be detrimental to public health. Studies from the University of Michigan, go blue
green,
found that
no, we don't want blue-green. That'd be bad.
No, we can't say green. Found that in lakes that have these zebra mussels, this algae is about 3 times more prevalent than in lakes that do not have the invasive mussels. So it's affecting food, it's affecting all kinds of stuff, and our own health directly as well.
Yeah.
So, Scott, I presume you're not going to say first class, but how do invasive species travel?
As long as they're not in quarantine. So how do they travel? Well, there's not a simple answer to this question. There's a few main ways that these organisms move from place to place. First, many species that end up being invasive, they're originally brought to areas for specific reasons. They might serve agriculture or other important purposes, and then they end up becoming established in these non-native habitats. So let's do another one of our examples here, cane toads. They were brought to Australia from South and Central America in the 1930s as a way to control beetle populations around sugarcane crops. And as these toads are carnivores, the initial intent was that they would be perfect to eat the beetles around the crops, lessening the use of pesticides. Unfortunately, these toads, they ended up not only eating the beetles. How did they not see that coming? They also were eating a lot of other native wildlife, including other native insects and even bird eggs. The toads, these cane toads, they're also poisonous, and they can harm the animals who would have been the predators of these frogs, making it difficult to control the populations once introduced in the wild without human intervention.
That sounds like textbook backfire.
Uh-huh.
All right. The second way invasive species can be introduced are when they are originally intended to be used as pets, or could be ornamental plants or flowers that were intended to be used indoors, but are then somehow introduced into the wild. Once these non-native organisms are introduced to the wild, they then establish themselves into the ecosystem. One study estimates that almost 85% of the non-native reptiles and amphibians on Florida's coastal waters have been introduced by the exotic pet trade. That's a crazy stat right there, too.
Freaking Florida.
One of these, the Burmese python, a large constrictor snake, is an invasive species that is found within the Florida Everglades. These snakes, which average 6 to 9 feet in length, just little guys, initially arrived in Florida in the late 1970s when they were initially sold as exotic pets from parts of India, the East Indies, and China. And if you are out there looking for a 6 to 9 foot pet snake, I have a lot of questions for you. Mm-hmm. When these snakes were either accidentally or intentionally released from people's homes, they were able to easily establish themselves within the region after acclimating to the new warm climate.
And then, Jay, we see some of the effects we were just talking about. A 2012 study of the region found since 1997, the populations of raccoons, opossums, and bobcats showed over 87% drops in population due to the introduction of these pythons. Other animals like rabbits and foxes, they basically disappeared within that same time frame. And this is largely due to the fact that these animals we're talking about, they would forage for food near bodies of water in the same habitats that the pythons frequent to look for prey. And this is kind of funny, though. Or, this is a good thing. There's actually a state-run Florida Python Challenge each year where people sign up to remove pythons from the Everglades, and the person who removes the most wins money. In 2023, it was over 10 days with over 840 participants, and the winner got $10,000. Now, Jay, I found out about this because I was watching my favorite show, Real Sports on HBO, and They did a whole story about this because it's kind of like a sport. And in sad news, Real Sports on HBO, they announced that this is the last season. It's like my favorite show.
Oh, I thought you were going to say, like, I'm still envisioning these 6 to 9 foot snakes, right? And I thought you said, sadly, one of these snakes got a participant and, the thing was canceled next year. But my goodness, I'm just sitting here wondering how much money it would take for me to willingly go and hunt for these things. And I don't know if it's 10K.
If any definers go and do this challenge, I don't know what we're going to give you, but we're going to give you something.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. So while some species are introduced on purpose, there are many more examples of species that have been introduced unintentionally. One of the main ways invasive species are introduced is by accident. This often occurs via contaminated freight or movement of wood products, plants, or food. Individual animals and plants or their seeds, eggs, or spores can hitchhike their way into these shipments and move from place to place.
All right, so you may remember the Asian giant hornet that made headlines in 2020 when the invasive giant insect was spotted for the first time in the U.S. in Washington state. These hornets, nicknamed murder hornets, affectionately, maybe, I don't know, are the largest hornets in the world. Most notably, they are predatory and capable of killing humans if stung multiple times and can absolutely devastate a local bee population by infiltrating their hives and attacking bees directly, killing them and driving any survivors away from their homes. This discovery sent scientists on a years-long hunt to locate where the hornets could have worked to establish themselves in the region, and crews were successful in locating and eliminating a few newly established nests. Jay, did you say you looked these guys up and they're pretty intense looking?
I was about to say, definers, maybe do yourselves the favor and just leave these hornets in your memory from a couple years ago, because my goodness, I just Googled them and these things are nightmare material. I mean,
I wonder how big did they show the stinger?
There was one I saw where a guy was holding the head of one such that it could pull apart its pincer jaws. And oh man, between these and these snakes, Scott, I don't know what we've gotten ourselves into.
Yeah, I mean, some of these invasives, they look nice actually when they're out. There's certain plants that look nice. Right. But some of these animals, and plants too, they're just like monsters. Totally. Crazy.
Well, and Scott, now that we're on this topic, I have to mention it, but there is an invasive species out here in Denver. It's a plant. It's called the tree of heaven, I believe. And these things, just grow like wildfire. You can see them sprouting up as little sproutlings, and then they eventually grow into these massive trees. And, I'll say Anna and I are casually Zillow shopping right now. And I came across a picture of a house whose backyard actually had one of these invasive trees, in its own planter box and kind of decorated as there's a patio surrounding this beautifully framed tree. not realizing that this thing is invasive. And my goodness, I mean, it's just if you don't know where to look, you have no idea how common these things are, but goodness, they're out there.
Yeah, and I wonder if there are some people that are like, hey, you've got too many invasives in your backyard, like remove that, or I'm not buying the house, or
Right.
I bet that comes up.
Okay, so Scott, we've given some pretty strong and frightening background about just the context of invasive species. Let's ask now how this issue has evolved over time, whether it's gotten worse, more complex, and then ask if it's going to get worse into the future.
Well, Jay, the issues are only set to increase, and the key explanation is globalization. As levels of global trade and travel have increased, the ability for these invasive species to be spread and introduced, it's increased. Globalization ultimately facilitates the spread of these species, whether intentionally or unintentionally. It is predicted that as globalization continues to expand in conjunction with changes in how we use the land and the sea, coupled with other demographic changes, the number of invasive species, and the subsequent impacts will also continue to increase, and species that have already been introduced into areas will continue to thrive by expanding into new regions.
Anibal Pochard, a professor who helped to co-chair the previously mentioned IPBES report, has stated that while it is normal and common for species to move, we are currently living in the unprecedented era where organisms are jumping big barriers and moving between continents more easily than ever before. So while it would be normal for a species to travel within a country, for example, we are now seeing that they have the ability to cross entire oceans due to the fact that humans and our technologies travel across continents.
All right, so the second key factor after globalization contributing to the expansion of invasive species in some regions is climate change. Warming temperatures are helping some plants and animals thrive and expand their habitats to regions where they have not been found historically, creating new opportunities for species to become invasive.
All right, so, Scott, we just talked about these pythons, right? We were talking about how this issue was kind of central to Florida. And I'm willing to guess that we had some definers in Georgia and maybe Alabama being like, that kind of sucks. Florida just how to deal with these pythons. Well, don't go to sleep just yet. The Burmese python is one of the species that is set to expand their habitats due to climate change. A January 2023 study determined that these snakes are currently expanding their habitats further north in Florida, and their range will continue to expand in the next 5 to 10 years as climates start to heat up elsewhere, potentially expanding their reach beyond Florida and into more states within the southern U.S. Sweet dreams, everybody.
You've all been warned, so. In addition, extreme climate events like hurricanes and floods can actually play a role in transporting these invasive species from one area to another, while also decreasing the built-in defenses that native ecosystems have against a potential invasion. Further, some of the control tools that are used, like aquatic barriers to keep invasive species out of other habitats, can be made less effective due to the impacts of climate change. As these invasive species already play a major role in changing ecosystems, if you couple this impact with other climate change impacts, this can be a recipe for disaster for many ecosystems to be significantly altered. Jay, I hadn't really thought about the whole hurricane thing, kind of picking up stuff and putting it where maybe it shouldn't, but yeah, makes sense.
A 2020 study predicts that the number of established invasive species will increase by 36% between 2005 to 2050. This study applied a model based on historic invasive species data and then looked into how this data could predict the future.
Generative invasive species, if you will.
Yeah, God. The results of the model showed that strong increases are projected to occur in Europe, parts of Asia, North America, and South America, and the potential for invasive species decline in Australia and other parts of Asia. Of course, this scenario is dependent on many factors, including any mitigation and prevention policies or programs. However, wide-scale efforts will be needed to make significant progress in this area due to the impacts of globalization and climate change, like you mentioned just a minute ago, Scott.
Interesting, Jay, the model found declines in certain areas.
Yes, absolutely. And I was also just like, it's not expected to, I guess, either increase or decrease in Central America. So it's interesting how that plays out. And of course, definers will link to this study in our show notes if you'd like to pursue further. Okay, Scott, let's ask who is leading the effort to combat invasive species.
All right, well, because invasives touch nearly every corner of the world, there are organizations working to combat invasive species and minimize their impacts. Government agencies, international organizations, nonprofits, and academic institutions. invasive species has been a pretty key topic in conservation around the world.
For example, in the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA, is one of the leading agencies that is collaborating with other groups, both internal and external to the government, to prevent, control, and eradicate these species. The Wildlife Services arm of the USDA specifically has invasive species activities and works to create control plans and programs around certain key invasive species, including the brown tree snake, European starling, feral swine, and nutria. If you're curious, you can actually go online and see the action plans they have created around these specific species in the US and the progress they have made on those plans. Additionally, USDA's Wildlife Service has provided help to the public to fix the damages that have been caused by invasives.
Okay, now going to the nonprofit sector, the National Wildlife Federation, one of America's largest conservation organizations, is also leading the charge to prevent invasive species from spreading. The organization has programs and works to support and advocate for policy to take action on controlling the spread of these organisms. For example, the organization has a program that advocates for the treatment of ballast water, the fresh or salt waters that is held in the ballast tanks of ships, as this is often a main way that invasive organisms are introduced into new marine ecosystems. They also have educational programs for the public to help underscore the importance of using native plants and removing invasive ones.
One group working globally on invasive species is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. The IUCN Secretariat and Species Survival Commission Invasive Species Specialist Group work together to tackle invasive alien species and their impacts at all stages, from providing essential data and expertise to guide policymaking through to action on the ground.
I will say, Jay, I was a bit surprised as we were researching this that we couldn't seem to find an invasive species focused group, elsewhere around the world that is like huge and just has so many resources tackling this. There doesn't seem to be one. If Definers, if you find one, please message us. We'd love to hear if there's others you're following.
True, Scott, or perhaps a gap in the market for some of our more entrepreneurially minded definers out there. I think I just made up a word. Okay, Scott, what policies are being pursued to address invasive species?
All right, well, globally, that IPBES report that you mentioned, Jay, it highlights that while the impacts of invasive species are complex, they can be prevented and managed through effective tools and governance options. The report found that 80% of 196 countries have targets within their national strategies and action plans to manage biological invasions. Further, in the past 10 years, more countries have developed these policies. Though there's still significant policy work to do globally, having that biodiversity plan, key step in the right direction.
Totally. And Scott, because invasive species cross all boundaries and legislative jurisdictions, controlling them can be difficult to coordinate, and action often needs to be orchestrated by many different levels. Globally, these policies are still evolving, but the role of policy in this area will likely increase as the problem worsens.
Okay, so in the U.S., state and federal policy to combat these issues has been limited due to the lack of resources and lack of concern from the public, unfortunately. However, in 1999, an executive order established the National Invasive Species Council, or NISC. This council is co-chaired by the United States Secretaries of the Interior, Commerce, and Agriculture, alongside other key members of federal agencies like the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Health and Human Services, and Homeland Security. Members are tasked with coordinating, planning, and leading the Federal Invasive Species Program, working with local and state governments, along with smaller private organizations and tribal partners. The Council also works to not only prevent, eradicate, and control invasive species, but also hopes to restore ecosystems that are negatively impacted by these invasives.
This executive order also allowed for the development of a National Invasive Species Management Plan and allowed for the creation of the Invasive Species Advisory Committee. The Invasive Species Advisory Committee helps to provide information and advice for the NISC's consideration and has helped since 1999, minus, of course, a couple years of defunding in the Trump administration, to provide input on federal policies and emerging topics of interest. This committee is composed of members at all levels of representation, state, territorial, tribal, and local governments, as well as academic institutions, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector.
All right, and quick note for aquatic life, specifically in the United States, there is the National Invasive Species Act. It grants $4 million annually for states to implement their state aquatic nuisance species plans. That's a thing. But like many policy actions, this act is yet to be fully funded.
In the EU, there is the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, which contains the commitment to manage established invasive alien species and decrease the number of red list species they threaten by 50% by 2030. The Invasive Alien Species Regulation includes a set of measures to be taken across the EU in relation to invasive alien species. The core of the regulation is the list of invasive alien species of union concern that currently has 88 species on it. The species included on this list are subject to restrictions and measures set out in the regulation. These include restrictions on keeping, importing, selling, breeding, growing, and releasing into the environment.
All right, so a little bit of US, a little bit of EU. Let's look globally now, Jay. And the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, its members have stressed the importance of invasive species control as a way to prevent biodiversity loss. In 2002, the convention released the guiding principles for the prevention, introduction, and mitigation of impacts of alien species that threaten ecosystems, habitats, and species. This guidance seeks to minimize the risk of biological invasions from crossing borders and emphasizes the need for collaboration to minimize the associated risks.
Invasive species are also a focus of one of the targets in the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This framework was adopted in December of 2022 at the CBD's 15th Conference of Parties. It has been referred to as a Paris Agreement for Nature. Target 6 says, quote, and this is a long one, so guys, bear with me, eliminate, minimize, reduce, and or mitigate the impact of invasive alien species on biodiversity and ecosystem services by identifying and managing pathways of the introduction of alien species, preventing the introduction and establishment of priority invasive alien species, reducing the rates of introduction and establishment of other known or potential invasive alien species by at least 50% by 2030, and eradicating or controlling invasive alien species, especially in priority sites such as islands.
That 50% by 2030, that's pretty ambitious, especially when we said that the cost of invasive species quadrupled every decade for the past several decades. But all right. So, but let's end on a positive note. We want to mention that a review of 1,550 eradications on nearly 1,000 islands since 1872 found an 88% success rate using methods such as hunting, trapping, and targeted poisoning to help restore the island's biodiversity.
For example, in 2011, rats were eradicated from Palmyra Atoll in the mid-Pacific. The germination of native plant seedlings increased by more than 5,000%. 2 previously undocumented crab species became abundant, and coral began to recover.
And the garbage service was much better without the rats.
Seriously. All right, so let's now ask, what can definers do to help address invasive species?
All right, so the Nature Conservancy lists 6 main ways we as individuals can help stop the introduction and spread of invasive species. First, we can verify that the plants in our yards and gardens are non-invasive. We can also take steps to remove any non-native plants in our gardens and focus our landscaping on native plants, as many common, exotic, or ornamental plants, while they can be beautiful, can harm natural ecosystems. Second, if you're boating, make sure to clean your boat thoroughly before moving into different bodies of water.
Next, regularly clean and inspect your shoes, tires, boat, or any other equipment that is used outdoors, and remove any insects or plant parts that may have tagged along with you and are unintentionally being spread. Fourth, we should be mindful to not, quote, pack a pest when we're traveling. Many fruits, vegetables, plants, and animals can be invasive or carry pests, so it is important to be mindful of when we may be unintentionally harboring an invasive species without knowing it.
Fifth, we cannot release anything into the wild. This is especially important if you're a person who likes to keep exotic or non-native pets. I'm talking to you, the person who loves alligators.
Yeah.
You should never unleash them into non-native habitats. Many pet owners do not ever plan to release their pets. Cool. But when their pet alligators, aquarium fish, or reptiles become too big, difficult, or aggressive, these once loved pets, they're often released into the wild rather than properly transition into a new home. It's important to find proper channels to rehome your pet, as this can turn into a serious issue if we've been talking about. Or maybe you just want to reconsider having them as pets at all. Right. This does go for aquarium fish, plants, and live bait. Jay, who knew the people that chose to have alligators as pets were making bad choices after that? Oh,
I've just still been trying to wrap my mind around, an alligator with like a pet collar on,
mm-hmm.
and it's just not working. All right. Lastly, we can become engaged in learning more about species that are non-native in our area and volunteer at local parks to work directly on the issues and or educate others about the issues. The National Wildlife Federation suggests learning how to identify the species that are invasive around us so that you can identify and report any sightings to your local wildlife officials. You can also join local groups in removing invasive species from your parks. Now, Scott, I will say we're talking about this topic of invasive species. I'll always remember, I think, when Union Market in DC was first opening up, we went out there and it's this kind of cool, market collection of different kinds of stores, from phenomenal coffee and bagels to, empanadas, whatever.
Yeah.
There was I think it was I can't remember what exactly. It was some kind of like lunch sandwich place that was selling an invasive species fish sandwich. So maybe it was those tilapias that we were talking about earlier. I'm not sure, but perhaps doing your part could also be going out and dining on these invasive and hopefully tasty species.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about it, but that is a thing that there's more and more of these chefs saying, "Hey, let's create some market demand here." These competitions to remove the pythons. That's one way to get people out there. But also, if there's a market for these invasive species, that can also help lead to their eradication.
Totally.
So, yeah, some chefs are doing that. All right. So, expert guest, Jay. We've got Leigh Greenwood, Forest, Pest, and Pathogen Program Director at the Nature Conservancy, TNC. So, Leigh sits within the North America Natural Climate Solutions team. She works to bring stakeholders together to achieve common goals in support of forest health from the forest, pest, and pathogen perspective. Her projects include managing the Don't Move Firewood campaign, convening the Continental Dialogue on non-native forest insects and diseases, working to improve the international biosecurity measures in place for solid wood packaging, and leading partnership efforts to accelerate the development of pest and pathogen-resistant native trees. Leigh's leadership of the Don't Move Firewood campaign has led to its being widely regarded as one of the most innovative public outreach arms of TNC.
Leigh earned her BA in biology at Williams College and her MS in wildlife biology at the University of Montana in Missoula, where she studied the intersection of native wildlife, invasive plants, and biological control insects. Let's hop over and dive a little bit deeper.
Okay, welcome, Definers. It's an early morning for us, maybe not for you, but we are here. We're excited to talk with Leigh Greenwood, Forest, Pest, and Pathogen Program Director at the Nature Conservancy. Leigh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, so we did look at your LinkedIn and your Nature Conservancy bio, and we now know that you have this bachelor's degree in biology and a master's of science in wildlife biology. So tell us more about that. Like, have you always been interested in wildlife and nature? How did you end up pursuing these degrees?
Yeah, I've always been really interested in wildlife and ecosystems and nature. I grew up in an area where I had a lot of access to walking trails and forests and just beautiful places. And I feel really lucky to be able to pursue that passion from when I was a kid all the way up to my professional career. And I did my bachelor's and my master's on opposite ends of the country. So I have some really cool experiences in different places, from Massachusetts to Montana. So it's really interesting to work across that spectrum too, across North America.
Okay. And then your master's program, you studied at the intersection of native wildlife and invasive plants. Like, do you know where you first heard about invasive species?
Yeah, I sure do. I was thinking about that, and I think the first invasive species I ever knew about was spongy moth, which is an invasive. Yeah, spongy moth. It's like an invasive caterpillar found in the eastern United States. It can completely strip trees of all their leaves in a bad year. And, thinking back on that, I mean, I certainly, as a kid, didn't know what an invasive species was defined as, but I just remember, they were really bad some years. And, our trees in our backyard would just look really bad. And now as an adult, I realize, it was already affecting sort of my view of the natural world when I was a pretty little kid.
I've just got to jump in and say, with names like spongy moth, we've got a species here called tree of heaven that's invasive.
Yeah.
I think we got to work on these marketing names because they're a little bit too like flowery for me.
The topic of invasive species names is utterly fascinating and probably something we should cover in a separate episode.
But didn't they get their name before they became invasive necessarily sometimes? Like you're just calling them what they were always called, but then they become bad once they go somewhere else, right?
Well, not precisely, because every common name starts in its own language. And so, if it's named one thing in its native range in Germany, it's going to have a different name. And if it's also native in the UK, because you're going from German to English. And then when it gets to the United States, it may or may not hold that English name or that German name. It might have a whole new name. It gets really complicated.
Is there an example of just a total change in name for purposes like Jay is saying, for like communications or marketing, or not so much?
Yes, it actually happens all the time. And one of the invasive species I specialize in, the Asian longhorn beetle, is got a way cooler name in its native range in China, the starry skies beetle.
Wow.
I mean, so much cooler, and it's a black, it's a big black insect with bright white speckles that are really like brilliantly white on a black background. So it's a beautiful name in its native range. And then we gave it sort of this like less beautiful name when it was found in the United States.
Yeah, interesting.
I got to be honest, Lee, I did not expect you to have an example ready to go. So kudos to you this early.
Yeah.
So before we, maybe get to your next role, which is going to be renaming all these species, let's focus on where you are now, which is at the Nature Conservancy. You lead the Forest Pest and Pathogen program. So could you just describe for us what that role entails, and then perhaps go on about the programs and projects that you lead in particular?
Yeah, I'd be delighted. So forest pests and pathogens are insects and diseases and nematodes and all sorts of different organisms that negatively affect trees and tree health. And at the Nature Conservancy, we are extremely invested in protecting tree health, both for the sake of nature and people who depend on forest and wood products for their livelihood, as well as for natural climate solutions and benefits. So it's really important across the world to protect trees and forests in order to maximize sequestering and storing carbon. So we've got all these reasons that it's important to have a forest pest and pathogen program director that can really spend their time digging into what are the threats of invasive species on trees and how can we reduce them. So in that role, what I do is I look at the biggest picture of all the different types of threats and how they get worse and how they get better. And then I strategically picked out which ones the Nature Conservancy can jump into the most effectively. So those most effective spaces right now are the prevention of additional invasive species moving within global trade. So for instance, in packaging, in cargo, things that shelter inside of spaces can get inside those big metal containers. So those are international movement pathways of invasive species. That's a big area of my work. Then another space that I try to really work on is the movement of materials inside the US and Canada that then spreads invasive species much faster and makes their impact much worse. And the biggest that I work on is the movement of firewood, but there's actually quite a few other ways that forest pests and pathogens move in the US and Canada besides just firewood. It just happens to be that we have really good expertise and partners in that space. And at the end of sort of what happens when an invasive species becomes really severe, has a really, really strong impact. At some point, you have to look at protecting the resource it's affecting, so the tree species or the group
Hmm.
of tree species. And so I also work on a relatively new project that is serving to accelerate the creation and breeding of resilient trees to specific invasive species. So for instance, ash trees that are being really heavily impacted by emerald ash borer, I'm
Yeah.
working with Forest Service scientists, and those Forest Service scientists have really fascinating forward-looking research projects to try to naturally breed ash trees that don't die or don't die as fast from emerald ash borer attack. So it's a huge spectrum of projects. We try to really
Yeah.
pick and choose what's strategically the most important. Certainly, we can't do everything, nor should we. But there's a couple things that the Nature Conservancy really dives into.
It's almost like having your own little business and deciding strategically like what's the best market or the best invasive species problem for us to play in given our available resources and knowledge.
Yeah, Scott, that's really insightful because it's a whole world out there. And I think everybody in nonprofit spaces and climate protection and climate resilience spaces realizes you can't do all the things all the
Right.
time. You've got to sort of think really hard about where can you have the best impact right now. On the direct term, we have no time left to waste when it comes to tackling climate change. And
Yeah.
if I can make an impact on protecting trees in North America today, then that's what I should do because, we need to make sure that we've got carbon in the forests, that we've got programs in place to protect trees for future generations, and we've got to start that, right now.
It does make me think of that mantra of the idea that, every job can be a climate job. Leigh, to your point, there's
Hmm.
very few positions where you could, anyone could realistically have an impact as broad as everyone knows needs to happen. But I think that's why we love talking with experts like yourself to zero in and see exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone has a role to play in climate. Like you just said, every job has a climate job sort of aspect. It might be big, it might be small, but I think we all need to get it right. And then that's your contribution. And with forest pests and pathogens, we have a number of different contributions that we can make to, not only, of course, climate goals and climate resilience, but also biodiversity, environmental health at large. Even human health comes into play. So it's a full spectrum of work, but invasive species are so fascinating that it's just really a really interesting space to play in.
It sounds like a very interesting job that you get to look at this whole landscape, understand the problems, and then go do something about it. But I wonder, while you're saying it's interesting, we talked in the introduction about how these invasive species are causing a lot of problems and the problems are worsening. So, first direct question for you about invasive species. What is your most despised invasive species, even if it's not one you decided to work on directly?
Yeah, wow, that's a tough one. It's important to remember that invasive species are typically pretty innocuous or at least sort of in equilibrium in their native habitat. So it's hard to pick an invasive species that I despise because it's not really their
Hmm.
fault. But I
Right.
am fully willing to make an exception for invasive mosquitoes. I
Oh,
think I think that's where I'm most comfortable in saying that I actually just hate them. And invasive mosquitoes, which is a lot of different types of mosquitoes, they
hmm.
cause just an unbelievable amount of human suffering. They spread multiple human diseases, malaria and others. They prey primarily on low-income areas that can't afford things like bed nets to protect themselves. And
Mm.
then invasive mosquitoes also are responsible for the extinction and near extinction of many native birds, especially in tropical islands. So
Hmm.
not only do invasive mosquitoes harm human health in really, emotionally devastating ways, they also kill birds.
But because they bite them like they bite us,
Yeah,
and then they
yeah,
spread
yeah.
diseases amongst the birds.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
So first of all, they're damaging in that they can, lower just like we get upset when we get attacked by mosquitoes. A bird can have just general effects from being bitten by mosquitoes, but
hmm.
also they spread a disease that actually is called avian malaria. So it's the bird version of human malaria. It's a
Oh,
different disease, but it's in the malaria family, and birds that come from evolutionary groups that have never experienced malaria, they die readily from avian malaria. And I just think that that's terrible. Human
yeah.
accidental movement of contaminated water that has mosquito larvae in it has caused human suffering and bird suffering. So if there is something that we should despise, I feel like it's the mosquitoes.
Fair enough.
I think that's a pretty easy one to rally around, Lee. Nice choice.
Hmm.
Yeah,
All right.
thanks.
So let's keep moving forward here. And I want to circle back to an initiative that you referenced just a minute ago, the Don't Move Firewood campaign. Sounds very interesting as a way to educate the public and engage the public. So tell us more about it. How did it get started? And what positive benefits have you been able to see in reducing invasive pests and disease from it?
Yeah, so this is a really classic example of how human decision making by one person can seem logical, but when
Hmm.
you extend it across time and space and modern civilization and society, it becomes a big problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the Don't Move Firewood campaign is a behavior change campaign. So we are trying to encourage a specific protective behavior. And what that means is that we want people to buy local firewood, or when it's appropriate, collect firewood on their campground site or near their cabin or whatever, or buy heat treated firewood when it's available. And the reason that we're trying to encourage these positive protective behaviors is that firewood is, as you probably realize, a dead tree. And a dead tree can contain all sorts of different forest insects and diseases. And when you're moving firewood long distances, you can accidentally, over time, move loads and loads and loads of invasive insects and diseases to a new place.
Mm.
And often it's your favorite place. So you're seeding your favorite campground or your uncle's cabin or whatever with forest insects and diseases. Again, it's tough because each individual person might just sort of not realize that this behavior can be damaging. But when
Sure.
you look at the whole of America, over 50% of Americans say that they use firewood in a given year. So you're talking about over 150 million people making decisions that could potentially transport invasive species and start new infestations. And as a whole, we need a cultural shift that realizes that firewood has this unique capacity to accidentally move invasive species. And with that, we should decrease the chance of that happening by using these better behaviors on firewood.
And is there like a key performance indicator you measure that you've noticed a change that since you've started the campaign? Back to business KPIs for what it's
Yeah,
worth. But
yeah.
yeah.
KPIs in human behavior are phenomenally challenging. And when you've
Mhm.
got an intersection between human behavior and an unlikely event, man, it's really hard to give yourself an actual key performance indicator there.
Yeah,
But what we have done is we have done some research on attitudes, which is a sort of index of an indicator. So it's an imperfect measure, and I appreciate that that is a little frustrating at times. But in our imperfect measure, we see that people who have heard of firewood and forest pest ideas, or better yet, have seen either our materials or our partner
yeah.
materials, they say they will not move firewood long distances. So they indicate a willingness to do the better behaviors. Now, I'm not with them when they pack their car for the camping trip. I can't actually guarantee that they are following through with what they stated, but
Sure.
I sure hope they are, and I bet the majority of them certainly are.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you giving us that imperfect indicator. I get that it's really difficult to know with these sort of communications campaign what was the actual behavior that resulted. But it's good to know that if people saw it, it made a difference in what they were reporting in terms of their attitude.
I'm a little disappointed, though, Leigh, that you're not, at the homes of all these people as they're packing for their camping trips to say, yes, no, yes, no. I guess I would have assumed that you'd be able to be in every home like that.
I do have a busy travel schedule, but at some point, 150 million people would really just, I mean, that's like Santa Claus level right there. I don't think I could make it. But I do want to be in everybody's email inbox. And so one of the biggest things we do to reach those 150 million people or more per year is that we work with campground reservation systems for like national parks and U.S. Forest Service campgrounds and even sometimes private campground associations. And
Sure.
we say, hey, will you please put this information in your confirmation email? And it says, like
Nice.
quiet hours, where's the dump station for your RV, dog leash. Also, please make sure to buy local firewood. And by and large, campgrounds want to protect the trees on their campground. And so we've had incredible uptake of that through the years because it's also protective of the campground's natural resources or the area's natural resources or whatever. So, I mean, I can't tell them all, but what I can do is I can work with the people where it's going to have a direct impact on their trees. And so that's the angle our program takes.
I love it.
Yeah, I've definitely seen the messaging before, and maybe we've met before as a result. Maybe I've gotten one of your emails, but I thought we were meeting for the first time today, but maybe not. So I wanted to ask you about some of the other things you're involved in. So the Continental Dialogue on Non-Native Forests, Insects, and Diseases. You started this, right? Can you tell us more about it?
I'm happy to say that I definitely work on it, and I'm the lead convener of the group at this time, but I didn't start it. It was actually started. Yeah, no, it's okay. It was started before me by a group of Nature Conservancy and other partners. And I'm now in charge of it. But the Continental Dialogue on Non-Native Forest Insects and Diseases, it's an unwieldy name. I'm just going to call it the dialogue. And what the dialogue is a forum for many different types of professionals and interested parties in forest insects and diseases to meet up and share their most likely impactful strategies and their greatest concerns so that they can take action. So sometimes in this world, as you all know, an issue like sustainability or invasive species, it's so big that you're not even sure who is the most important actor in this space or what industry holds the greatest interest. And so the dialogue serves to bring people together to identify where could we move forward with something that would improve the situation. And like I mentioned earlier, it's really important to identify, both near-term and long-term goals, especially when it comes to forest health because of its link to climate change and carbon sequestration. So we're looking from the dialogue's perspective at the protection of trees, but also the broad perspective of the protection of forests and the environment.
Sure. How often does it meet?
Our schedule got a little weird with the COVID pandemic, but we had met once a year in the past, and we'll be meeting once a year in the future.
Okay, that's great. And then we also want to ask you about another dialogue that you all have, or another thing you're engaged in, this Invasive Species Advisory Committee that we talked about in the introduction as well. Like, what's that like? How often does that meet? How often are you engaging? What are some of the outputs that you've done as part of that?
Yeah, that's a really cool group. It's a federal advisory committee, so it's non-federal people from throughout the U.S., lots of different industries and interest groups who nominated themselves to be on the committee and then were accepted. And we meet, we have a formal all-committee meeting every few months, essentially, but then each of the subcommittees meets via video conferencing.
You got to have subcommittees of a committee. I mean, the only way to do
It's
it.
a, yeah, I mean you got to break it down, right? So there's three subcommittees, and
Okay.
each of the three subcommittees is working on a priority issue
Hmm.
and is generating a written document that will be advice. So remember, it's a federal advisory committee. We're here to provide advice to the federal government. That's in the name. And so we're writing these advice papers essentially, and they will be presented in near final draft in November to the secretaries of all of the agencies. So the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of Agriculture, all those good folks that are within the federal government.
And will they
The
be public, the reports?
Every product is a public product, and you could look it up on the internet if you wanted to. The final drafts certainly will be published
Okay.
products. There are three subcommittees.
Yeah, what are the
Um,
focus areas?
Yeah, so one is a broad scope of what are the priorities of the people on invasive species. So,
Hmm.
the federal government has its own opinion of priorities, but they're asking the Federal Advisory Committee to say, well, what do you believe to be your priorities? So
Hmm.
that's subcommittee one.
Okay.
Subcommittee two is a deep dive into the outsized impacts of invasive species on underserved communities and peoples.
Hmm.
So that's a really, really fascinating topic. You can imagine invasive species are devastating in so many ways. It's even harder if you are already struggling in another realm to deal with invasive species. So that's subcommittee two.
Yeah.
And then subcommittee three is invasive species and climate change intersections. So
Hmm.
that's
Okay.
the subcommittee that I am the chair, the leader
Oh,
of.
nice.
Yeah, and we are writing hopefully an amazing paper on specifically how invasive species can undermine climate change adaptation and resilience at a big scale. So basically, as a nation, we're working really hard to create resiliency and adaptation. And if you literally or figuratively undermine the adaptations, um, then with an invasive species that is out of control, then you won't get as far in tackling the climate change crisis across the United States.
Well, those sound like three very good choices. And you'll have to tell us when the final reports are public because we'd love to share that on our social media and such.
I would be delighted to.
Okay, great.
So, Leigh, you are chock full of fantastic examples, initiatives, specializations that motivate you to continue tackling this massive issue. But we like to take a step back here and ask a question pertaining to eco anxiety that we like to ask of a
Mm.
lot of our interviewees.
Hmm.
So, as definers are putting together not only in this interview but in our introduction, certain invasive species can spread very quickly. They can be very hard to contain. And as we're talking, they can cause significant damage to economies, environments, people. We want to know really two questions of you, Leigh. Are there times where this problem seems really just too tough to tackle? And perhaps can you tell our listeners about a time tackling invasive species that seemed too daunting, or perhaps another time where you felt hope about our prospects to make a real impact here?
Absolutely. Invasive species can be downright depressing at times. It can feel like a tidal wave of damage and loss. And that's very real. I think that, eco anxiety or climate change anxiety is it's right. These are really, really difficult existential issues. But I do appreciate the opportunity to kind of provide both the when do I feel like I'm losing hope and when do I feel like I'm more hopeful.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard. So the space where you're losing hope is when an invasive species is both poorly understood and moves fast. And that's one of the things that can happen. So Science, as a big capital S, science offers us a lot of hope, and policy offers us a lot of hope with invasive species, but the the barrage of problems can outpace both science and policy, and so
Yeah.
that can be just really really hard. A good example of that is we have tried across the US and Canada for about 20 years now to control and slow down the emerald ash borer. That's a
Right.
small green insect that kills all manners of ash trees, which are a common city tree as well as a common forest tree. It's all over the eastern United States. And one of the reasons that the Don't Move Firewood campaign has been so important is that it's so easily moved in firewood. It survives well for the in-cut firewood. And ash trees make good firewood. So it was really hard to watch as it spread, despite the really great policy and human behavior campaigns that we had to try to slow it down. And we did slow it down. There's really good evidence that the impact of emerald ash borer was slowed and reduced, but certainly not brought down to zero by any means, through behavior change and basically market limitations on moving ash tree saplings as well. But it's still spread. And it was found last year all the way on the western United States in Oregon, probably moved through the transport of infested firewood. So we did everything we could, and we made big impacts. We probably saved millions, if not billions of dollars of tree removal costs and infrastructure costs over the last 20 years by slowing this pest down. But slowing is not the same as stopping. And so it's hard to just take heart in the fact that we made a big difference, but that difference is hard to put your fingers on sometimes. So that's really tough. But let's be more hopeful, because there's also really cool examples of hopeful situations. And that's kind of what keeps me going. I think one of my favorite and kind of, I don't know, outrageous hopeful situations.
Here we go.
Oh yeah, is the northern giant hornet, inappropriately named murder hornet. It's a bad name.
Oh, we talked about this in the introduction, right?
Yeah. So the northern giant hornet is a huge insect, and it stings like the dickens apparently. And a bunch of them were found a few years ago in Washington and the southern edge of BC, British Columbia. And they got these crazy moon suits, and the federal government, USDA, went out in collaboration with the Washington Department of Agriculture. They took these amazing videos, which you should totally link to in your podcast, of these insects, and they had little radio transmitters on them to find the hives. And you know what? When's the last time you heard about that infestation?
A solid couple of years ago.
Because they got rid of it, right? We talked about it, I think, in the introduction,
That's the coolest part of the story. There's this traumatic pause, and you're like, shoot, I haven't heard about that for like a year or two, have I?
Absolutely. No one's been stung like the dickens.
Nobody's been stung like the dickens. Because you know what? Invasive species disappear not only from the landscape, but also from memory. When we eradicate them. We have such a crazy media landscape in modern life that you don't even notice when nobody is publishing articles about northern giant hornet anymore. They just kind of aren't there. And you got to call out the successes, because otherwise we'll forget they happened. There are, to the best of our knowledge, no more northern giant hornets in southern British Columbia or northern Washington. We got them all. They found them. They're gone.
I don't know, Leigh. I think there's someone who's got one as a pet somewhere.
I mean, it's a really bad idea for a pet because they for so many reasons. But for one reason is that
it's a joke.
No, now I'm curious, Lee.
Yeah.
Why are they not good pets?
Well, most of them only live 1 year, and that's a really depressing pet.
Oh,
That's a great point.
okay. Sold.
Yeah. But now we're moving on to the next issue with, a success behind us.
Yeah, no, I
Love
love
it.
that. And what are the next issues? What are the trends that you're seeing? I mean, I wish we could say that we were eradicating things left and right, but this issue just keeps on growing in importance. What should our listeners be clued in on in terms of what's coming next on this topic?
I would say one of the things that I really appreciate seeing is an increasing acknowledgement that the issue of invasive species is a heck of a lot more than just a biodiversity and biology kind of issue. It has
Mhm.
staggering impact on climate resilience, the well-being of people and social systems, and just financial impacts are wild in some
Yeah,
cases. And so it used to be that conversations on invasive species were framed in sort of a stuffy, like research format of biology losses and so forth. And that is no longer the case in the slightest. And I think that's really good because that brings in people that didn't realize how much they had to offer and how much they had to lose from invasive species in their systems.
Well, Lee, I think this conversation has been full of these, but I think one of our last questions for you is, are there any particular key takeaways that you would like to emphasize for our definers as we wrap up this conversation, or perhaps suggestions for them to take their own action?
For anybody that has their own business or heavy interest in sustainability from a professional standpoint,
yeah,
I think we all need to really demand accountability and excellence from our policyholders. We have a lot of laws, regulations, treaties, different levels of protective sort of devices that should be protecting the environment and economic and human health systems from invasive species. But they only work if we uphold them, whether that's through attention or through enforcement or through properly funding those efforts. And so if you work in an industry where invasive species often become a problem. So for instance, if you work in a green industry where you're moving a lot of plants or plant materials, you know that invasive species are a massive issue to your business.
hmm,
You should go to your policyholders and say, I want you to make sure you are taking the best, most science-informed actions to control invasive species in my industry. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that I think we all need to do more actively. Solutions are out there, but if we don't pay close attention to them and make sure they are equally adhered to by all the parties, so even playing fields, those solutions won't work the way we need them to work.
okay, Lee. So yes, I'm with you. If you're in one of these businesses, you got to really think about this and demand action from your policymakers. And you mentioned people that work in green industry and moving plants. So let's imagine ourselves at the Botanic Garden, and we're amongst all these plants, and we're talking about invasive species with the person we're with, and someone overhears it, and they're like, "Tell me more," and then we want to hit them with a fact that he or she hit them with a fact that is like, "Whoa, I didn't know about this issue." What is something we can tell them about invasive species? Like a quick hit stat to draw them in so we can then tell them more about all the great stuff you've shared with us.
So, one of my favorite facts about invasive species is that there's a cultural festival that we all appreciate and love that has a crazy tie to invasive species,
Okay.
and that is the Cherry Blossom Festival in
Mm.
Yes.
DC. Yeah, right. So it's absolutely the most beautiful sort of like transcending moment in DC every spring where all the
Yeah.
cherry trees, they bloom, they're just gorgeous, and then the little petals, they filter through the light. It's beautiful. And those cherry trees have this amazing history as a gift from Japan a long time ago. The Japanese government at the time donated a few cherry trees to the government of the United States, and those trees arrived in DC, and they were completely ridden with scales, I believe it was, which is a very small insect. They're kind of hard to see. And it's probably that they didn't see them when they left Japan, but those scales, which sort of nibble at the tree and then eventually kill it, could have caused the collapse of the cherry industry, which was sort of young. This was young America. I think this was in the 1800s. So the folks in DC, they called in some experts, and this was more than 100 years ago for sure, and they burned them. They burned those trees to the ground to prevent the spread of those invasive insects and diseases to all of the local cherry trees, both the native and the orchard cherries in the greater DC area, because even then they realized that having trees moving in the global supply chain, in this case, a gift from a government, a beautiful thing, could pose such a huge risk to American agriculture. And then they contacted, the Japanese government, and they said, hey, can you just send us another set of trees, but just make sure there's nothing wrong with them this time? And sure enough, they did. And then they've sent trees, and it's been a beautiful international partnership that has resulted in the Cherry Blossom Festival ever since, because the issue of forest insects and diseases and invasive species at large is one that every government recognizes. And we all know that you cannot let these things get out. It was more important to burn those trees and start fresh than it was to potentially risk cherries and the urban forest all around the DC area in that moment.
I live in Washington, D.C., and I am very excited at the next party to say, hey, did you know the first time we got all those cherry trees, we had to burn them?
It is kind of an amazing, it's a hard stop. There wasn't a lot of insecticides back then. There was really not a lot of choices. And man, when you don't have a lot of choices and you recognize a threat like that, man.
And I am doubly impressed because I'm looking up pictures of these scale insects and they are tiny. So I am impressed that people picked this up, acted on it so swiftly, and that we have a healthy batch of cherry trees all the way from Japan again to enjoy this festival that I know Scott enjoys every year. I spent time in DC for a few years, loved that time as well. So what a fantastic little story, Leigh. Thank you.
And it must have been a pretty quick decision too, for those little guys to not get out, and then the burning wouldn't have stopped the problem. So yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Well, Leigh, oh my goodness. Thank you so much for sharing so many insights, for all the work you're doing, be it on the advisory committee, through the Nature Conservancy. Let's all not move firewood. Let's all buy local firewood for sure. And just keep up all the great work you're doing. Like we said, please tell us when those reports are out from all those subcommittees. We'd love to share them. And anything else we can share with our defenders, please keep us in the loop. And thanks again.
I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been wonderful to spend the morning talking to you guys.
Thank you, Leigh. Oh my goodness, Scott, my pet alligator is on the loose. I got to go chase him down. So let's wrap this thing up ASAP.
Jay, I thought you were going to give that thing to a very responsible group that was going to take care of it. Fluffy, the alligator.
All right, so we would like to thank Taylor Price for yet another killer set of intro notes. We'd like to thank Keaton Butler, our audio engineer, for tying this thing together oh so beautifully. Mm-hmm. We would also like to thank Square Peg, Round Hole, and Potions for the jams in this episode. Mm-hmm. And Definer's quick tease of our upcoming holiday hodgepodge episode, where we will be conducting our annual Instagram giveaway for some selected products for all of you out there for free. So be sure to stick around for next month's episode and score yourself a new pair of free surprises.
I can't believe it's already that time of year, Jay, for the annual hodgepodge episode. Crazy.
For real.
Okay, and we did not get a review. It's all good. But if you have time, please go to Apple Podcasts, leave us a review, and we'll probably read it on the show. We did get a couple emails from listeners that gave us some good feedback. We had a good dialogue with them, and it's very useful to get thoughts on how we can improve. So send us emails, hosts@sustainabilitydefined.com. Would love to hear from you about anything. So with that, Jay, I think that about does it. You all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We will see you next time.